Good evening. Please stand as the procession is about to enter the venue.
Good catch. Good evening, late afternoon, everybody. Can everyone hear me? I'm Anthony Lize. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome all of you here physically and everybody online. I do believe we have people online as well to this inaugural professorial ceremony, which our guest of honor tonight is Professor Lize van Robbroeck. I'm a bit out of breath because I'm excited for Lize. Because also I turned away an inch from pneumonia, apparently, with the latest little lovely virus that's around. And as long as anybody doesn't make me laugh, I won't go into a coughing fit. Okay, so if I keep it nice and easy, we should be fine. So everyone here, I just have to say, single out a few people. Firstly, our Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Research, Innovation and Postgraduate Studies, Professor Sibu Moyo. Welcome, Professor Moyo. And then, of course, we go to our Deputy, shall we call you a Deputy Vice Dean? No, our Vice Dean for Research, Professor Lindy Heineken. Then I'm going to go straight to Lize. I'm just supposed to be welcoming Lize, but I feel like there's so much I can say about her. I don't know if I'm allowed, but I think I'm going to abuse the fact that I do have the microphone. So Lize, a hearty welcome to you on this very special day, and also to your wife, Dr. Maxine Spedding, who I did see. Hi, Maxine. Welcome to you. And of course, to all the friends and family on Lize's and Maxine's side, and then all our academic colleagues and friends and any other guests that are here. I want to extend a very warm welcome to you. Fortunately, we are heading into spring. It was quite warm today, so that's nice. Also for the viruses to go away. So I'm just the order of business. In a moment, I'll be calling on, and I forgot to welcome then, firstly, Professor Stella Viljoen. She will be doing an introduction about Lize, call it an academic socio-bio kind of thing. And then Lize will come up and do her inaugural, and I can see here the PowerPoint and the graphs already. It's going to be very interesting, that I can already say. Then when Lize has finished, Professor Moyo will provide a brief response to her inaugural. And when that is done, Dr. Catherine Smith, who is the chair of the Department of Visual Arts, which is, of course, where Lize hails from, she will do a thank you. And then we are done. But before I hand over to Stella, I just want to say it's a very special moment for me as well. I've known Lize for a considerable amount of time and a very, very interesting circumstances as well. Some of you may know that Lize was a vice dean as well a number of years ago. In fact, when I started out as acting dean in 2016, she was already on the scene. She was a vice dean for arts at the time. And if I had to say that our faculty was facing some interesting challenges, I think I'd probably be using an understatement, and I'll leave it at that. And actually, the other vice dean that started out in those days, also here tonight, Professor Ilse Feinauer. She was vice dean for languages. But back to Lize. You know, one can ask yourself, what is it to serve academically, not just being an academic, you know, and doing what academics do, and that is teaching and research. And Lize will be speaking about her research and you know, what she's passionate about as far as her academic career goes. But it's also about, at the professorial level, to provide service and when you are called upon to provide academic leadership. And I thought a little bit about what that is, you know, academic leadership. And the one thing, you don't get paid a lot for it. We all know that. There's a little bit of a stipendium which will help with the petrol tank in these days. But you do it because you want to provide service. And you do it, and leadership in that respect is a very unselfish act, an unselfish act. Because usually nobody comes around and pats you on the back afterwards. Some people will do, but that's not why you do it. And I can just say about Lize in those days, she gave very unselfishly, made a huge difference in that period of time in our faculty. I think our faculty owes her a great debt of gratitude for that, and I certainly do. And I remember she a couple of times helped me out of some very tight spots with her wisdom and her emotional intelligence. I had to say that. I know it was just a welcome, but I wanted to say it. So having said that, up next is Professor Stella Viljoen to do the introduction. Thanks, Stella.
Thank you, Professor Leysens. Thank you, Professor Moyo, Professor Heineken, for the honor of allowing me to introduce Lize van Robbroeck. I cannot imagine working in a more perfect team than Lize van Robbroeck and Ernst van der Wal, the visual studies golden girls, who frequently find themselves in rough terrain as if having stumbled onto the set of Game of Thrones. Winter is coming. What will we do? While Ernst runs ahead to scout new ideas, to determine the direction we should take, I look behind, constantly returning to the places we have already been, the scenes of former crimes. Lize, in this campy metaphor, digs deep. She puts down roots, sets up camp, builds a tent and a fire. She studies her surroundings and makes notes about the fauna and flora. She meets the locals and learns their language. She gathers food and cooks, and when we return to camp, she feeds us and tells us wickedly funny stories that make us laugh and make us cry. Lize van Robbroeck is the very epitome of a scholar. She invests in a set of ideas to the exclusion of all else. She digs deep and burrows into the fabric of a discourse so that she understands every side and angle of this framework in the most nuanced and sensitive way. She is an intellectual, but her understanding is not cold or cynical. It is deeply personal. She is affected by her scholarship. It changes her and all around her. Lize has Bachelor of Arts honours and master's degrees from Wits. Her doctorate was completed at Stellenbosch University and was entitled Writing White on Black, Modernism as Discursive Paradigm in South Africa. This is still the definitive text on the disciplinary polemic and epistemological problem of white art historians dominating the scholarship on black artists. In 2011, Lize edited a volume of the seminal anthology Visual Century South African Art in Context, 1907 to 2007, published by Wits University Press, a project that rewrote South African art history of the 20th century. In 2020, Lize co-edited the anthology Troubling Images, Visual Culture and the Politics of Afrikaner Nationalism with Frederico Freschi and Brenda Schwaman, also published by Wits University Press. Lize's extensive publishing career has centered on a critique of the haunting whiteness that codifies settler imaginaries and modeled decolonial arguments well before this terminology became fashionable. Her writing and teaching have been instrumental in establishing the intentions and methodologies of African cultural studies in South Africa and has relentlessly introduced local visual culture from Peter Clark to Jean Brandrett to Foucault Politica to an international community curious about our national histories and politics. Following her publications, her undergraduate and postgraduate curricula are so trailblazing that they are constantly emulated by other art schools and cultural studies programs. This would be a problem if it weren't for the fact that her courses on psychoanalysis, decolonization in the arts, and post-humanism have simply been too informed by her muscular engagement to be replicated. Lize was instrumental in unsettling the art historical canon in South Africa and continues to not only establish visual culture studies as the more ethical and progressive offspring of this discipline, but to ask what this should look like on the African continent. There is more to say about the many national and international awards she has won from the Ampersand Foundation, Clark Art Institute, Getty Foundation, and NRF, the fact that she was editor-in-chief of Third Text Africa and sits on the boards of international associations, the many exhibitions she has opened, the king-making catalogue essays she has written. But I will end on a note about her devotion to her graduate students. Lize is an extraordinary supervisor who frequently takes on the most challenging students and teaches them the business of thinking. Each time I examine one of her students, I marvel at what she has achieved in them. Finally, Lize's generosity of spirit is born out of love, and this love appears in unexpected places. Her love and respect for the incomparable Maxine Spedding, the love of Lize's life and her partner in crime, is not surprising, as is the love for her sisters and family. But Lize's love for her students, her colleagues, the created world, models for all of us an ethics of care. She is invested in how things end. She cares about bees and penguins and polar bears and destitute doggies and the psyches of her friends and racism and drought and corruption and poverty to an almost paralyzing degree. And it is this same love and care that makes her a good scholar. Lize is that rare kind of academic for whom scholarship is not an occupation, but a conviction. Lize, oh captain, my Dorothy, I'm honored to sit at your campfire.
Sure. I'm utterly blown away by these two most beautiful tributes, really. I'm immensely moved. Thank you. Both to Tony and to Stella for really heartfelt and beautiful words. I'm not going to do the more thank yous and welcomes because that's the job of my colleagues who kindly agreed to take on the task. But I do just want to say that I dedicate this talk to my lovely Maxine, and also to thank her for being my best friend and always, always standing by my side and being my cheerleader. So my talk is titled Art and the Legacies of Whiteness at Stellenbosch University's Visual Arts Department. Recent mortifying events on our campus again brought home how dehumanization and othering remain deeply entrenched in our body politic. Across the globe, rising demands for decolonial epistemologies and restorative practices clash with the resurgence of white supremacy and neo-fascist nationalisms. We drown in a litany of ideological divides, bitter culture wars and toxic cocktails of disinformation and fact, while devastating real wars rage on, and catastrophic climate change causes an epidemic of paralyzing anxiety, especially among the youth. New emerging fundamentalist regimes are systematically undoing decades of hard work to win women's rights, while the feeding frenzy of the neoliberal greed fest keeps escalating as the last of what we arrogantly refer to as our resources are being plundered. In this eventful moment, an interrogation of the legacies of colonialism remains not only relevant but crucial, because all the above can be seen as the fallout of epistemologies globalized through colonialism and Western imperialism that normalize division, hierarchy, and the instrumentalization of human and animal bodies. Nowhere is this more keenly demonstrated than in the former settler colonies, the cliff face of the colonial encounter. Hence my decision to focus on 4 artists, all former and current lecturers and all students from our department, whose work reveals something about the legacies of Western imperialist epistemologies and their accompanying representational and economic practices. This address occurs in 4 stages, in each of which I mobilize a different theoretical lens. I first adopt a critical psychoanalytic approach to the work of Anton Kannemeyer, where I explore the ethical limits of postmodern appropriation as satirical device, and propose that what Lacan calls jouissance, the painful gratification associated with the release of repressed psychic materials, not only compels the artist's mobilization of racial stereotypes, but also underpins our enjoyment as whites of these angry jokes. Here I raise the question, can colonial archives be revisited in ways that do not re-inflict the original wound? I answered this question through the book art of our former head of department, Keith Dietrich, who's also here tonight, and cautiously propose via Adorno's understanding of the term that his decentering and revisioning of the settler colonial archive can be regarded as redemptive. I follow this with a look at a less anthropomorphic investigation or anthropocentric investigation into the lasting legacies of colonial practices, a doctoral project by Adrian van Eerden, who under the supervision of my colleague Elizabeth Gunter, undertook a rich multimedia interrogation of the haunted effects and effects of centuries of capitalist extraction on a 16-kilometer stretch of our west coast. Finally, I use a new materialist lens to look at my colleague Ernst van der Wal, who is also here, recent exhibition Invasion, which I interpret as a philosophical undoing of Western scientific epistemologies and representational practices, and ask whether the human can be reinserted in the frame in kinder ways that does not repeat a humanist self-centering at the expense of other material bodies. Anton Kannemeyer, a student at this university and later a lecturer, is known for his visual provocations that have generated much controversy throughout the years, initially from conservative campus authorities in the 90s, when he targeted Afrikaner Protestant white authority via bitter comics. More recently, mainly from black viewers who argue that his use of racist tropes, no matter how deconstructive in intent, perpetuates rather than challenges centuries of annihilating white practices. Visual controversies are frequently triggered by white male South African artists of Kannemeier's generation. I think of the cartoonist Shapiro's Rape of Justice in 2008, which I return to later, and of course Brett Murray's notorious Spear in 2012. That these works emanated from artists of similar age, race, and class suggests that a common pretext provides a clue to their choice of provocation as satirical device. This would include childhoods in middle-class nuclear families, exposure to the frontier ideals of settler masculinity through ideological state apparatus such as churches and schools, but also in more seductive guise, as relayed through youth culture such as Tintin and photocomics, a cultural interpolation that was followed by the looming threat of forced conscription as young men. And last, but not least, a shared lexicon of rebellious punk culture that stood in grungy opposition to these patriarchal forces. Now, as adults in post-apartheid South Africa, these men share the ambivalent privilege of being the involuntary inheritors of white masculine power and all it has come to represent. That these artists often worked in intertext with one another supports a deep level of mutual identification. Jonathan Shapiro, better known as Shapiro, came out in support of Murray during the Spear controversy to produce a cartoon in which the Union buildings, the administrative and symbolic seat of the presidency, sported a penis rather than a cupola, while Anton Kannemeyer produced a painting of a large disembodied phallus floating above a crowd of angry black protesters bearing a banner proclaiming "Respect for the President's penis now." Through these mutually supporting provocations, these artists suggest that the root of Zuma's failings as a leader lies in his profligate sexuality, a point that I return to later. We need to consider that each of these artists launched their careers as visual commentators with harsh critiques of Afrikaner Protestant authority, using very similar satirical devices. During the turbulent 1990s, when Kannemeyer was a student at Stellenbosch, he frequently directed his anger at his actual tyrannical and much hated father, the prominent Afrikaner intellectual J.C. Kannemeyer. The white father is a forbidding and merciless force, a figure of hatred and fear whose sexuality is a source of boundless fascination and awe. In strip after strip, he exercises his power over women and children with the absolute entitlement of a tyrant. He is simultaneously the law and its transgression, and abuses his plenitude of identity and power shamelessly. In this excess of enjoyment, he resembles nothing as much as Freud's eponymous primal father. As the possessor of seemingly unlimited jouissance, he is also the source of unremitting envy and resentment. The lexicon of Oedipal rebellion for both Kannemeyer and Murray has remained intact for the last 3 decades. See, for instance, these 2 sculptures, one a masturbating, rifle-carrying ape by Brett Murray from 1990, called the Voortrekker, which of course had Afrikaner patriarchy as its target, and the image on the right of coupling baboons from 2010. It's, in other words, 20 years later exactly, called The Party versus the People, which generated much anger for its use of simian images, which reminded of a deeply ingrained colonial conflation of Africans with apes. It's clear that the targets of their satire and the broader socio-political context has shifted in ways that has major implications regarding how this vocabulary is received. When the exact same language of merciless mockery is used to target black authority figures in the post-colony, a very different semiotics comes into play. Always already a potent signifier, the phallus acquires additional signifying power in relation to race. It's not my place to talk about the damaging effects generated by these works amongst black viewers, but anyone familiar with the anti-colonial writings of Frantz Fanon will know that this stereotype reduces the black man to his penis, and paradoxically also castrates him as a subject in the symbolic, since it signifies his affiliation with brutish nature rather than civilizing culture. What is clearly disavowed by the artist is this vital question of context and address, that a black man is at the receiving end of this attack. A black man, moreover, that represents, no matter his failings as a leader, the possibilities of black attainment and power in a post-colonial world scarcely healed from centuries of white contempt, misrecognition, and systematic oppression. And here I need to briefly remind that Derek Hook describes disavowal as, and I quote, a defense mechanism by which something is denied even as it remains conspicuously evident. Kannemeyer's statement about the Spear debacle violently chooses to interpret the call of Zuma's young black male supporters for respect and recognition as a defense of the rampant black penis. To elaborate this point, I turn to another more recent work that generated heated debate in the press, The Liberals, an image that is in intertext with Shapiro's highly controversial cartoon, The Rape of Justice, which was made in response to Zuma's ongoing corruption charges in 2008. Lacan distinguished between the artist of the statement, whose intentions are consciously expressed, and the artist of the enunciation, who is driven to articulate repressed or taboo feelings and thoughts. I will discuss Kannemeyer's appropriation of Shapiro's cartoon as a joke intended for the white viewer, but also unconsciously produced as a provocation for black men. I propose that jouissance is a major factor in both the production and the reception of this image. I start with a brief exposition of Kannemeyer's stated intentions, which was to expose the implicit hypocrisy of liberal white political correctness. As in a lot of his work, the gollywog stereotype, to use Kannemeyer's own description, visually externalizes the enduring white racist presuppositions and phobias that he sees as lurking behind the facade of liberal anti-racism. Kannemeyer's dark, angry humor is intended to provoke discomforting and complicit laughter from his white audience, as it gleefully reveals and thereby confesses to deeply inculcated whitely thoughts and habits. There is an unmistakable element of shameful pleasure that Kannemeyer expects to elicit from us as white viewers. In Lacanian terms, his work provokes jouissance, which can be described as a kind of painful enjoyment, as I've mentioned before, and to quote Derek Hook, a negative pleasure of intense libidinal arousal that is both gratifying and disturbing insofar as it is transgressive. This enjoyment relies on recognition of the racist lexicon of a shared white childhood, which now requires the viewer's repudiation. A repudiation that is instantly undermined and exposed as hypocritical by the viewer's irrepressible laughter. Kannemeyer's cynical irony cements a kind of knowing and deeply compromising white solidarity that subverts attempts to overcome the racist structures of our inherited colonial symbolic. There is an element of social inclusion implicit here that leaves black viewers not only in the cold, but again misrecognized, inflicting fresh wounds to the black imaginary. What we experience as white viewers is Kannemeyer's own transgressive jouissance, which triggers painful, sadistic impulses in us because it compels us to enjoy that which our superegos instruct us to hate. Most of us, who are products of a similar white middle-class upbringing, laugh at Kannemeier's jokes somewhat shamefacedly because we recognize, to use Zizek's description, the entire dispositive of power at work, which bears witness to a deep solidarity. We laugh at these visual puns with our hands over our mouths to hide our shameful collusion in the master's brutal, coercive discourse. The public outrage mobilized by works such as these raises the difficult problematic of white speech in the post-colony. In that regard, I must make it clear at the outset that I take no issue whatsoever with the substance of any of these artists' political critiques, or their rights to make them. But I do raise ethical concerns about the form their critiques take. The concept of freedom, as contained in these artists' demands for the right to freedom of speech, becomes a problematic master signifier of whiteness, one that ironically attempts to foreclose further discussion and debate. Many authors have pointed out that the notion of individual freedom is deeply implicated in the discursive structuring of masculine whiteness, and that this rhetoric is always already closely imbricated with a dialectical undoing of the rights of others. Even more so, I argue, these artists articulate their unconscious rage at the thou shalt nots of an Oedipal symbolic that they experienced as oppressive in their youth, and now project onto the irredeemably other persona of Jacob Zuma. The notion that the hypersexed black other has illicitly and malignantly stolen the white man's own rightful jouissance is a point that is made by several authors writing on the psychoanalytic dynamics of racism, including Slavoj Žižek and Derek Hook. There is a significant dynamic at play in the way these artists' careers shift from Oedipal revolt against the white father in their youth to, ironically, a ventriloquization of their father's colonial discourse in their later work, when they depict black men as possessors of a limitless power conferred by boundless sexual enjoyment. While purporting to be self-reflexive and self-parodying, it's doubtful whether images such as this succeed in re-signifying either whiteness or blackness, dooming us to repeat an endless dialectic of misrecognition and rage. Yet, decolonization compels archival revisitations, not only to raise awareness of the epistemological experiment of race, but also to understand how this discursive fiction remains so deeply entrenched in every aspect of our body politic. In a relatively recent interview, Kannemeyer himself seems to acknowledge that this art can be read as a problematic form of reification, and I quote him, "The thing is, irony has a destructive power, and you reach a point where maybe it has finished and something new needs to be built up in the place of that irony." Significantly, Brett Murray has similarly acknowledged the need to revisit his visual tactics and strategies to meet the demands of a different context. Following public outrage in response to exhibitions such as Pippa Scottness's exhibition Miscast, which was in 1998, which focused on colonial representations of the Cobham, and Brett Bailey's reference to human zoos in Exhibit A and B, one may well ask, can the colonial archive be mobilized by white artists, no matter how well-intentioned, without reifying its damaging discourses and tropes? I engaged this question by looking at an exhibition and book project by former colleague and chair of our department, and dear friend, I want to add, Keith Dietrich, titled Fragile History, Fugitive Lives, the final of a series of projects in which he explored distinct aspects of the settlement of the Cape of Good Hope in the 17th and 18th centuries. In each of these books, Dietrich attempts a poetics of redemption by revisiting the colonial archive, yet subtly transforming it, in the process revealing both the deep and enduring structures of diverse colonial epistemologies, but also suggesting the poiesis of their undoing. I briefly need to situate Fragile History, Fugitive Lives within the series of books that preceded it, because they all constitute one project that in a way looks at different aspects of colonial practice and discourse. In his first book for this project, Horizons of Babel, Dietrich explored the spatial aspects of globalized modernity by charting the expanding horizons of Western knowledge as represented by successive cartographic conventions. As one of the earliest contact zones between Africa and Europe, the Western Cape makes for a rich exploration of the geographics of the colonial encounter. This project explored how mapping can be seen as symptomatic of the modernist compulsion to describe, name, control, systematize, and ultimately subordinate nature to the superior rationality of culture as a uniquely Western preserve. In this next image here, Dietrich used existing maps to overlay the concept of terra cognito, the known part of the world, in other words, known by Western explorers, and the terra incognito, the unknown parts. And there's a dividing line that you can see here on the left. And the practice of populating the unknown parts with images of fantastic figures such as the Blemii, this person with a face on the front of its chest that you see there in the middle. So he references these practices, but you'll see that he also included Wonder Woman in this image, thereby exoticizing the West and also producing a kind of concertina effect where time is compressed and the notion of teleological, chronological time is undone. In this way, he both reifies colonial tropes but subtly undermines them. And in this next example, which I also want to discuss just very briefly because it's so beautiful, he created these panoramas from photographs that he took. So they're hand-painted, but they still acknowledge the mediated photographic instrument that he used to produce them. And in the installation, he arranged the panorama in such a way that it really deconstructs the whole purpose of the panorama, because panoramas are associated very much with visual, with the conquering of the planet through Western imperialism. It arose along with that whole historical process. And of course, the panorama attempts to see absolutely everything from a godly perspective, where the artist stands in the middle of all that he surveys, the master of all that he surveys. And Dietrich arranged this in such a way that the viewer is compelled to view it from the outside, that you cannot actually enter that circle and view the panorama as intended from the center, but rather from the margins, upside down and inverted. That's another example of how he uses the colonial archive. The second project in the series, 14 Stations of the Cross, investigated the colonial encounter via one of its most historically charged and morally ambivalent manifestations, the missionary station. In this three-part book, the earliest missionary settlements in southern Africa were represented as crucibles in which the complex heterogeneity of the future South African nation were forged. Detailed archival information about baptisms are superimposed over baptismal fonts. I don't need to go into the symbolism of baptism here. The earliest 14 missionary stations correspond to the 14 stations of the cross, which invites the viewer to walk the Via Dolorosa, in which redemption is attained through contemplation of suffering. Mazes and rivers of blood are overlaid on aerial shots of the terrain where these missionary stations were situated, cementing a bond between the human body and the geography of this country, and raises questions about belonging in the face of violent displacements. The next project, Many Rivers to Cross, focused on the great rivers of southern Africa, their confluences, tributaries, estuaries, and the vital role these played in the historic history of colonial expansion and local resistance. In all frontier histories, rivers serve as metaphors of violence and conflict, but also suggest liminality, and connection and potential healing through the life-sustaining powers of water. Rivers of blood run through each image, evoking our bloody history, but also a maze of familial bloodlines from across the globe that found itself making this our collective home. Dietrich's superimposition of 19th century engravings of human organs over images of rivers foregrounds the body as an object of knowledge and power, which recalls the importance of biopolitics in South Africa's history. This he would explore in more depth in Fragile Histories, where the dissolution of boundaries between inside and outside, between the seen and the unseen, between violence and healing, and between human bodies and the territories they inhabit is further elaborated. Via photography and collage, Fragile History recounts the biopolitical control of subjects in the Cape during the 1700s. Produced in collaboration with the historian and archivist Hans Jesse on the practice of justice in the Cape under VOC rule, this exhibition references a shocking litany of torture, humiliation, and death inflicted on errant bodies. Dietrich superimposes the archive's banal bureaucracy of names, places of origin, transgression, and viscerally shocking punishment over photographs of contemporary residents of the Western Cape, who collectively represent the diversity of the Cape's populations during the early modern period. Each portrait stands in for a broad segment of the population and the kinds of punishments meted out to that particular group. Indigenous peoples, female, broadly inclusive, burger, in other words, white subjects, and bastard, as they were called, people of manifestly mixed ancestry. Although race, that most fateful and unfortunate of modern inventions, is a discursive construction, it's first and foremost experienced by the body, the most intimate and immediate site of South Africa's traumatic history. If race was used to legitimate the creation of an underclass of workers and slaves during the colonial and apartheid eras, its corollary was a regime of physical punishment to keep those bodies obedient. Each portrait thus assumes the shape of a cross, hinting at both torture and redemption. In his seminal book, Discipline and Punish, French philosopher and historian Michel Foucault chronicles the role of physical punishment in the medieval and early modern epochs, and analyzes how spectacular public displays of physical torture and execution serve to keep potentially unruly subjects obedient and docile. Dietrich chronicles this appalling crucible of pain in which the body politic of a future South Africa was forged, launching a chain of intergenerational trauma that is asserted forcefully in present culture wars and controversies. The Cape's history is a history of fragile bodies being branded with hot irons, being dismembered, riveted in shackles, having flesh torn off, being hanged, stretched on a rack, broken alive on a wheel or cross. The list of tortures go on and on. Nowhere is it clearer that the history of modernity is also a history of globalization and violent cultural exchange than in the archives of the Western Cape. The names and designations of the unfortunate recipients of the VOC systems of punishment and control reveal the extraordinary diversity of the inhabitants of the Western Cape in the 17th century. Apart from the indigenous sun hunters and Khoi pastoralists whose names sing a forgotten poetry, and the burghers who came from European territories as far afield as Portugal, Italy, Germany, Great Britain, and the Netherlands, the largest contingent of the Cape's population consisted of enslaved peoples and convicts from the Indian Ocean world and the African continent. Ultimately, they were the products of this rich assortment, the genetically diverse children of the Cape called the bastards. Nowhere is it clearer that the white supremacist discourse of purity is invariably accompanied by the richest cultural and biological intermixings, just as the discourse of freedom is concomitant with the enslavement of human and animal bodies. The role of the visible in the biopolitical tactic of power and control cannot be overestimated. The body has been made to signify social status and bear visible traces of subjugation, objectification, and power. Not only does the individual body carry a life's physical trauma in scars, burns, wrinkles, and limps, but every body also carries the traces of complex ancestral networks of contact and conflict, and the epigenetics of intergenerational trauma. At this fraught juncture in our world's history, these full-length portraits remind us of our own fragility. The superimposition over the solar plexus of each figure of a vital organ surrounded by a rosette of names and punishments renders the intimate body porous and painfully vulnerable. For various reasons, redemption is a risky concept to work with, in the context of the post-colony in particular. First, because of its overt connotations with the Christian faith, which played an invidious role in cultural genocide and the establishment of white rules in the colony. Mainly, however, because the idea of absolution ingrained in Christian understandings of the term is deeply problematic, particularly for inheritors of white privilege. Yet Dietrich's strategic decision to work along rather than against the grain of received colonial discourses, to transfigure and subvert these discourses in such a way that they become stripped of the supremacist function and reinvested with redemptive potential, works for a variety of reasons. Redemption, if divested of its metaphysical Christian intentions and returned to its Latin roots, redimere, meaning payback, means to recover through reparation. For the descendant of the white colonial order, the first price that has to be paid is a deeply disquieting confrontations with the strategies that established, globalized, and maintained white supremacy. In Dietrich's refiguring of redemption, absolution or closure are not options. Rather, redemption resides in remembering, and in the process recovering a common history of displacement, pain, loss, uncertainty, and guilt. The humanity that is redeemed here is not the triumphant universal man of Western humanism, but the embodied subject of a diseased world order, the body marked by difference, racked with pain and loss, sustained by love and compassion, and always at the mercy of others. I now turn away from the problematics and ethics of representation in and of the colonial archive to look at other legacies of Western imperialism, the environmental consequences of capitalism as the invisible driver of colonial and neo-colonial practices. To do so, I refer to a remarkable doctoral project by Adrian van Eerden-Wharton, completed under the supervision of Elizabeth Ginter, which calculates the costs of extractive capitalism to the more than human world of the West Coast. This practice-led project entailed in-depth research into the ramifications of a long history of extractive practices along what is commonly known as 16 Mile Beach, much of it now the West Coast National Park, which stretches from Eiserfontein in the south up to Tsaarsbank in the north. Also included is Postberg Nature Reserve, the Donkergat military training facility, and 7 islands along this part of the coast. Obtaining permits and permissions to access restricted areas, Van Eerden spent 4 nomadic years along this stretch of the coast, walking the same terrain month after month, immersing herself in the sea, being burnt by the sun, drenched by rain, filming, photographing, and sound recording, as well as documenting archival records in Cape Town. Her aim being to record, and I quote her, material affective encounters within literal death zones, sites haunted by violent legacies where heightened precarity marks the lives of Earth others. In a sense, this multimedia exploration can be described as a documentary project, but departs from the conventions of the genre in significant ways. Van Eeden created a neologism, photomediations, to describe how her work mediates, both in personal terms and as communication, what had been a very painful experience for her. This is a documentary project that does not make any claims to objectivity. Rather than being a dispassionate witness to what she encountered, Van Eeden describes her role via a related term coined by the feminist theorist of affect Bracha Ettinger, witnessing, a word concept that suggests an act of co-poiesis between the researcher and the material world she traverses, where the human observer is always already entangled with and relational to that which is observed. The notion of an a priori observer, an independent objective subject who remains untouched by the object of inquiry, is thus radically undone. The project can also be experienced as an act of mourning, as indicated by the title, Saltwater Bodies from an Atlas of Loss. The project was handed over to examiners at the conclusion of an immersive experience arranged for us on Marcus Island and a section of 16 Mile Beach. After 2 days of immersion in the sights and sensations of this area, in order to experience some of what Adrian calls her situated knowledge of the place, where we participated in silent rituals of mourning and experienced a haunting sound installation in one of the disused houses on the island, we were also blindfolded and led into the icy cold waves, which was sort of quite a shocking experience. We were each asked to receive the immensely heavy burden of Van Eeden labours. A sarcophagus-like box made of engraved white concrete, containing the text and the photographs, videos and sound recordings, and a collection of hand-picked white mermaids' tears. The apt, poetic, popular name for the millions of plastic nurdles washed up on the coast, of which Van Eeden had collected boxes and boxes over the course of her research. Unlike most photographic documentary projects, where the artist selects a few carefully cropped photographs, the box contains hundreds of photographs. Photographs of dead seabirds, of dead seals, photographs of dead baby birds abandoned in their nests and shattered eggs, photographs of plastics, of deserted structures built for the looting of life, such as nesting boxes for the easy harvesting of penguin eggs, which became a much sought-after delicacy in late 19th and early 20th century Europe. Photographs of pages and pages of shipping notes for penguin eggs, and as many shipping notes for thousands of tons of guano scraped off the islands to fertilize the monocrops of the new colonies worked by enslaved black bodies, leading to the wanton destruction of centuries-old nesting sites. Guano, meters thick, that produced nutrient-rich runoffs that fed the base of the complex food chains that used to proliferate on this coastal zone. The proliferation of images is not wearisome, but rather deeply effective as the sheer scale of the die-off becomes apparent. Centuries of whaling, extraction of eggs, harvesting of guano, and radical overfishing by monopoly companies that systematically decimated the small, sustainable fishing economies that once sustained human societies along the coast has finally culminated in this death zone. What we see are the remains of what the environmental historian Jason Moore calls the Capitalocene. He prefers the word Capitalocene to Anthropocene, because Anthropocene implicates all humans in the disasters that's unfolding around us now. Van Eeden-Wharton describes these ravaged landscapes as shadow places, the haunted aftermath of systematic ecocide. This proliferation of visual evidence is more effective at conveying this tragedy than any Excel sheet with statistics or any other kind of scientific quantification. This is the reason why art-science interactions and activisms are so very needed in these critical times. I want to stop very briefly at these photographs of a site in the West Coast National Park where visitors don't go. This is where animal carcasses culled by hunters, who are invited into the park to hunt off the excess animals, are processed and packaged. I linger here because one of our most enduring fantasies, the idea of nature as a constant that continues to flourish in these parks, is undone by this necessary practice of culling, which is hidden from the visitors to the park in order to sustain this illusion. I also stop here to show how Van Eeden-Wharton departs from documentary convention by entirely eschewing its propensity for drama and voyeurism. These are very deadpan photographs that entirely avoid the drama of blood and corpses. From Van Eeden's photographs of life and death on the West Coast, where the focus has shifted from the ubiquitous figure of the humanist subject to the living and dying of Earth's multiple others, where the absent human figure is only a spectre of its own haunting effects, I ask how we can reinsert the figure of the human into a world thus devastated by anthropocentric greed. I turn to my colleague Ernst van der Waal's exhibition, Invasion, to attempt an answer. Invasion finds a place for the human among the infinitesimally small world of microbes and the incalculably large universe of uncountable clusters of galaxies. Humanist discourse has always centered the figure of man, and I use the male form advisedly here, as midpoint between heaven and earth, thus indicating the human's more than animal aspirations and making man the measure of all things as suggested by Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. I also include here the great chain of being in order to talk about the idea of man as the midpoint of the universe. Philosopher of science and feminist new materialist scholar Karen Barad has suggested that the concepts of bigness and smallness, with its built-in hierarchies of importance which invariably puts man at the center, can be more fruitfully imagined as scales nestling within scales, a poetic concept that I absolutely adore and explore in more depth later. I look at Ernst van der Waal's solo exhibition, Invasion, to rethink the classical distinctions between ontology and epistemology by using the new materialist formulation of onto epistemologies to show how knowing and being are inextricably linked and entangled. Van der Waal's exploration of scientific practice is acutely deconstructive of the notion of the unitary, autonomous figure of the scientist as Enlightenment subject, and undoes the binaries of subject and object implicit in the modernist Western trope of science as a value-free and objective discipline. The exhibition includes seemingly random and unrelated elements, a sculptural installation with strange sea urchin-like objects, close-ups of moons and other sometimes invented planets, supernovas, electron microscopic images of HIV viruses, aquanauts, quantity surveyors, skin-diseased patients. Yet all these diverse figures culminate in a coherent and poetic exploration of the intersection between our human stories and the material world, demonstrating that the new materialist insistence that wording is worlding and that our human epistemologies produce ontologies rather than simply reflecting them. I start with this image from a book on skin diseases, which is used by van der Waal to meditate on scientific inquiry and practices of scientific representation. But before I look at it closely, I first need to say something about the artist's method and medium, which are significant to the meaning of the exhibition. Van der Waal works with mid-20th century illustrations from medical and scientific textbooks that have been produced by dot matrix printers. So his method entailed taking these photographs, which of course was done on a grid, repeating this grid but on a larger scale, and then by hand painstakingly reinserting every dot to reproduce the dot matrix photograph of the original image. I return to the significance of this method later. The image of a doctor handling a patient is replete with modernist conceptions of science. We see the patient from the all-knowing doctor's perspective. The subject-object dualisms of modern science are underscored by the naked patient's total objectification, and the doctor, who is represented by the capable instruments of his hands and the white sleeves of his lab coat, a semiotic that unmistakably confers on him the authority of active meaning-making agent. The intrusiveness of the hands on the naked, vulnerable, and diseased flesh of the young man begins to explain the title of the exhibition, Invasion, which references multiple forms of intrusion: the invasion of the body by microbes such as viruses and bacteria, the human intrusion into the deepest mysteries of the material world on both macro and micro scale, and the incursion of exotic plants and animals facilitated by invasive human practices such as colonization and globalization. Van der Waal's choice to focus on skin disease is also significant, for the skin is that highly semiotically charged border between the inside and the outside, that which supposedly keeps us intact as unitary subjects, but which is, in fact, immensely permeable. Our skin breathes through our pores. It excretes inner substances while absorbing materials, secretes inner substances while absorbing materials from the outside. It provides a haven for a vast multiplicity of organisms. Because it is permeable, it's also vulnerable to the invasion of infections and disease. The sculptural installation is evocative of the central concept of invasion in multiple ways. These beautiful bristly forms were derived from an invasive species of sea urchin that is taking over our west coast, Tetrapygus niger, which was transported here from Chile by freighter and accidentally released in Alexander Bay. But they also evoke the form of virus, and though they were produced before the coronavirus arrived to upend our sense of secure and stable life worlds, they prophetically spoke of the permeability of bodies and ecosystems and the dense, entangled vulnerability of all life. The aggressive and threatening trope of invasion also speaks poetically of the close imbrication of all planetary and even extraplanetary matter, as I will show shortly. Images of moons and other celestial bodies are interspersed with enigmatic human forms. These are ambiguous and deceptive. An image of what appears to be an astronomer transpires to be a quantity surveyor. The figure of an astronaut is actually a scuba diver. The form of a Gandhi-like holy man is a skin-diseased patient. Slyly, Van der Waal undoes our certainties and undermines the evidence of our own eyes. The fallibility and provisionality of our human epistemologies stand starkly exposed. Primarily, the trope of invasion is explored in relation to the HIV virus, a topic of enduring interest to Huub van der Waal from his disciplinary field of queer studies. This is an electron microscopic image of an HIV virus being attacked by a white blood cell. The grid method of enlarging the dot matrix image is particularly poetic in this context, since the word grid is also the acronym for gay-related immune deficiency, an early term for AIDS, which targeted the sexual other. The painstaking replication of the dot matrix grid is also a wry comment on Walter Benjamin's critique of mechanical reproduction. The immensely labor-intensive act of reproducing by hand that which was produced by machine to save human labor undoes the entire edifice of modern instrumental science, as well as the modernist artistic notion of the uniqueness of the artist's signature mark. The interrogation of modernist practices via the figure of the virus also reminds of Lorenzo Veracini's likeness of colonialism with the virus and settler colonialism with a bacterial infection. This is actually a really useful and very beautiful analogy that I wish I had time to explore here, but look it up if you're interested. The lens of Western epistemology is turned back on itself, revealing the knowing humanist subject as the invasive sickness. In these two close-ups of two images, of a moon on the left and the virus just now discussed on the right, one can see interference patterns produced by the instrument of reproduction. These patterns are evidence of the presence of the apparatus of scientific inquiry, either of the lens of the camera or of the telescope that is reflected back into the picture. There is what Karen Barad would call a diffractive process happening here, where all bodies, whether living or inanimate, whether human or machine, interact with all other bodies to co-produce sympoetically that which exists in the thick now of the present, to use another Baradian term. According to Barad, the apparatus, which is always designed within a particular epistemological frame, comes replete with that episteme's presuppositions and expectations, and is itself implicated in the supposedly objective knowledge it helps to formulate. In this way, ontology and epistemology becomes inextricably conjoined. This exhibition celebrates our reliance on apparatus to extend our human vision beyond our bodily limitations, to see both on a macro and a micro scale, but also radically undoes the distinction between the very small and the very big. I here return to Karen Barad's beautifully poetic concept of scales nestling within scales. As bodies, we rely for our survival on multiple other creatures, so that most of our bodily mass actually comprises microscopic organisms wholly unaware of our existence as molar entities. Their life worlds nestle within our own, and within them nestle the molecular world of fantastic quantum energies and forces that totally undo the laws of Newtonian physics. Our bodies and life worlds likewise nestle in that which we call nature, the immensely rich and complex web of animate and inanimate forces that surround us. Our planet nestles in the solar system, which is one of thousands in our galaxy, which nestles among the innumerable other galaxies in a fantastically interesting pluriverse. Ecospheres are enfolded within one another, so that the concept of invasion becomes the norm rather than the exception. It becomes the driver of desiring production. In this final image, this notion of the undoing of scale emerges most powerfully. Here we see two images superimposed over one another, each on its own grid, overlaid to produce a new composite whole. The one is of an HIV virus, the other of a supernova, inseparably intertwined to make one monist world, comprised of the same basic ingredients. And I arrive at my conclusion. We are standing here on the cusp of many transitional states. First and foremost, of course, transition from the Holocene era of unprecedented ecological stability, in which the planetary web of life that shaped us arose and flourished, to a condition of terrifying climatic instabilities, the sixth great wave of extinction, and an accompanying spectre of economic and social collapse. Against this great planetary shift and connected to it are the urgent social justice concerns of a world transitioning from Western imperialism to a new post-colonial world order that is as yet opaque. Decoloniality is an ongoing process, one that must be constantly reimagined and redreamed. New decolonial strategies devised and old decolonial logics revived to accommodate the unprecedented experience in species memory of such large-scale humanitarian and planetary crises as face us now. As settler colonial studies makes clear, these social justice and environmental concerns are linked. They find their origins in an episteme and economic practice that became global through brutal imperialist tactics. The quest for a decolonial world has therefore to be inclusive of more ethical ways of inhabiting our planet and depicting our place in it as a species. It is our task as academics, white and black, to help imagine such an ongoing process of decolonization for the sake of our children and for the sake of all planetary life. Thank you very much. Oh, no.
Good. I think we're still, let's see, 1841. Yeah, it's still good afternoon, not yet evening. So just to say thank you so much, Professor Lize van Robbroeck, is that correct? Yes, thank you so much for such an amazing lecture. Lize did talk to us about the topic which she has covered really well, which talks about the art and legacies of whiteness at Stellenbosch University's Visual Arts Department. She has given us she has talked about, the archive of colonial representation, which is a very complex, I wouldn't use tricky, but it's still a complex subject for white South African artists, and also, in terms of the way we interpret it. And I think what she has really posed to us as a challenge is whether whether it's possible to actually describe these archives without causing any controversy. And she has given a list of examples where she's talked about the 3 artists who were at Stellenbosch University in terms of the work that they've done. But from my side, I'm just trying to say that maybe to talk about, the inaugural lecture today, I think also shows the epitome of the work that you have done over your career, and it also shows us the body of knowledge that you have contributed to this field. So within the university ranks, the stature of full professor is the highest stature that one can achieve, and hence this body of work that has been done shows us how Lize has actually occupied her academic career thinking deeply about the issues that affect us in terms of our universe, and then using different examples that she has given in terms of how we can use, I think as academics, as artists as well, how we can use the knowledge we have to make our world a better place. I think she tackled a number of examples, and I started off by writing some of the themes that I sort of got from the lecture around, the contribution that she has made to the visual arts using the history of art, critical theory, post-colonial studies, and also settler colonial studies, applying that in terms of the knowledge that she has contributed. There was a paper, I think, which I also thought was quite interesting, which I also got on your Google Scholar. I was trying to read some of the stuff. As you know, today is my day 6 at Stellenbosch University. So I thought, I don't know this professor very well, but I must Google her and check out something. So I found this paper on living with ghosts for a justice to come. Okay, I think, so I thought, what's that about? So I thought that was quite interesting, but it talks about ontology's formulation of time as endless, and opens up pedagogical possibilities for a number of disciplines in the humanities. So this type of approach, which allows for, I think, to have some, applications which can be done within the arts as well. And then there was another part which I think talked about the demonization in the political climate of some of the images that I used. And if you look at Shapiro, maybe, and most of you read newspapers, you can see some of the demonstrations. And I never really think about them, but I think the point that you bring out is some of these images and some of the reflections that they can cause and the way we would react to them, depending on what race group you come from. So maybe if you're white, it looks nice and funny, but we never really think about it. But I think the Zuma one, I saw one with Zuma there, and without putting myself into more trouble, since today's day 6, I shouldn't comment, but we saw what happened afterwards, right? So I think that as academics, really, in terms of responsibility, we have a big role to play in terms of sensitizing our communities and people in terms of the issues that we face. And also the responsibility of ensuring that the way we articulate issues that are happening in our society are able to really make us not just reflect on them and say, well, we have published the work and this is what happened, but also to be able to sensitize our politicians, our communities and our activists to be able to make a positive difference and changes, perhaps to policy and perhaps to the way that we do things as well. So one of the things that I took back is also that, and I remember this also from one of the quotations from Martin Luther King, who talks about, keeping silent to things that really matter. So if we see that something is going wrong and then we just keep silent, then it doesn't mean that things might get better. They can get worse for everybody. But we must all aspire as academics to make sure that in our paths, whatever we do, the knowledge that we have access to, that we are able to, to articulate the key issues so that they can transform the communities and also transform, hopefully, our politicians, our leaders, for us all to have a better life. I think there was another issue around sustainability. Some of the images for me that I used also talk about sustainability in terms of our climate. I think the very last ones, especially, I might have misinterpreted them, but I thought that maybe it was really a deep lecture in terms of using some of the images that also talk to sustainability in terms of our climate as well. So given that, I just want to say congratulations again for giving a great lecture. I can't, you spoke for us for a very long time, so I guess it would be remiss of me to kind of try and give a deep summary of all the points that you made. So otherwise, I should just then use this time to congratulate you for, being awarded the full professorship, which is the highest accolade within the university, and also to thank you for the contribution you've made to the supervision of students and maybe inspiring others, and then also to thank Maxine. Where's Maxine? If you can raise your hand. Maxine. Yes, for the support that you've given her. Behind every successful person, there's another successful person. So congratulations to you too. Congrats to you too. And congratulations to you as well, Professor. Okay, so let me say that slowly because this is the real thing now. Professor Lize van Robbroeck, to full professor at Stellenbosch University. And to that, I have a gift for you. I understand it's an expensive gift. Just give me a second. I have to bend to get it. Okay. All right, where's our corporate team? There's somebody who's supposed to do the camera. Is there, so she just gets it. The picture was already taken. Okay, so now we are doing the real acting, right? Okay. So thank you so much and congratulations. Lovely. Okay. So just give her a clap again. Can you clap for her, Professor Lize van Robbroeck? Yes. Please stand up and give her a clap. It was an excellent lecture. Yeah. Okay, you may be seated, but for those of you, I hope you brought gifts. I know it might not be the culture, but in African culture would give you gifts and kill a cow. So for those of you who can't do that, just make sure she has a great dinner tonight. I understand we have a vote of thanks now. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm vertically challenged, so you won't see me behind this microphone. It's my standard conference look. You just see a laptop with hair sticking out the top. It's my job here to extend thanks, and I'm going to respectfully ignore most of Lize's instruction to not make it about her. Lize was a key reason that I applied for a position here back in 2005. And I knew her as a fellow Witsi, although our paths never crossed there. And I also knew she would be a colleague to treasure, and some 15 years later, here we still are. From working together on the Visual Century project, to visiting my peculiar little project space in a Woodstock factory, and honouring it with her words and thoughts in an article that I continue to treasure, called Cabinet of Curiosity and Regret, something I think we can all relate to. I thank my lucky stars on the daily for her fearless wisdom and skrik for niks intelligence, as this lecture this evening absolutely demonstrates, especially as a relatively new chair where I've relied on her counsel and that of Stella and Adams, who are both of Lize's very dear colleagues, on numerous occasions. So thank you. Lize has also been a pillar of support during my re-specialization into the world of forensic research and service, which is a story for another day, which required periods of leave from the university to study abroad. So Lize and Keith Dietrich, who was a long-standing colleague and dear friend of mine too, thank you for being here tonight, Keith. Both of you were very important in that process and understood how which Lize spoke to tonight, this connection between art and science and how these processes are actually deeply connected rather than alienated from each other, and something we need more of. So thank you for speaking to that this evening. Lize, I know this year has had its ups and downs, but it's wonderful to mark the period of our formal return to campus with this in-person event, which is also Prof. Moyo's inaugural. So it's wonderful to have you here too. But to her nearest and dearest, and I thank Maxine for helping me with this list, Lize's sisters Hilda, Ria, and Nina, friends Michelle and Renata, Peter, Grace, Callie and Annie, Suzanne and Anna Marie, Tivan, Kathy, and Nolene, and then more formally, Prof. Leysens, Prof. Heineken, and Prof. Moyo. But I think the real instruction when I was invited to give the thanks was just to say thank you all for coming, for your time and attention. Our time is our most precious asset, so thank you for giving us and Lize yours this evening. And now, wine time. Thank you very much.
May I ask us all to stand as the academic procession leaves? Thank you, everyone.